Should we get going? Yeah, okay. Put the camera in. Okay, hello. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Sian Lund. I'm the EAP coordinator at the Royal College of Art, and this is my colleague Sarah.
Yes, Sarah Blair. I work with Sian in-sessionally and previously pre-sessionally, so I have those two perspectives to offer. Okay.
And so I'm going to introduce the background to the way that we have started to develop our approaches, and then we're going to ask you to have a look at some texts and have a little exploration of the text and see if any of that relates to what we've been talking about. So I've got about 10 minutes to just lay the background, so I might sound a bit like a French radio person speaking at very high speed, so I'll try not to. So our context is the Royal College of Art. It's postgraduate art and design, even though that's not in the name. So it ranges from subjects from robotics and automotive, intelligent mobility to fine art, graphic design. So it's a huge range and a huge range of texts, materiality, processes, etc. So that's the mix that we are that we're very curious about, and that we want to explore, and that we do explore through our teaching. And the disruption is the process through which students need to go in order to achieve an outcome. And we've called it academic because we're exploring what is academic, and we're also looking at it's not a piece of writing necessarily, we're looking at outcomes. So sometimes the students need to present quite a similar outcome to what they might do in a piece of writing. So we're keeping it quite loose, academic. So we're really exploring what is academic in the outcome, whatever that is. So first of all, we use the term curiosity because we are very curious to see what it means in an art and design context. When I first started, I hadn't worked in an art and design context, and I was quite blown away by the variety, the excitement, but the complexity of the outcomes and how to define these and how to define the features of them. So we have to break down our assumptions. We have to decide how we can categorize these academic features. That's what we were looking at. First of all, what do we do about our experience of academic writing and conventional writing, and how might we characterize what we see? So that's our curiosity. And I should say, actually, Sarah's background is in art history and illustration, so we work collaboratively very much on this, so coming from different perspectives on this. And secondly, disruptive, because we are looking at being disruptive in our teaching, because we are expecting students, and students are expected to be disruptive in their learning. So disruption in tolerating variety, diversity, things that don't fit into the conventional neat boxes of academic writing. So we're quite excited to look at both of these, curiosity about the outcomes and what we see, and disruption in the process of teaching and students developing their learning. So we are going to explore these two. First of all, we are going to ask you to look at some text, but we are not thinking of the text as a static structure. We are looking at it as an outcome, but we emphasize that it's not, to students, that it's not a static structure. We are looking at the features of the text, but we want to know how the students or the writers got to that outcome. What were the processes that they needed to go through in order to achieve this? So what were the practice of their development, their intellectual development that led to an outcome? So we are trying to identify features and look behind them to see how they might have been achieved. So we're exploring text, but not from a discourse analysis necessarily, but from a looking at the outcome and looking behind to think about what disruptive processes went on. So we're looking at this as a practice. So what was the practice that students underwent in order to achieve the writing outcome or spoken? It's a practice of meaning making, and we want to know, or we want to help students to develop that process. So those are the two elements that we hope to look at today. We are going to look at text, but we're really focusing on the practice behind that, the meaning making practice. So the text, we're curious about the text. I think that maybe we have one of the writers here, I'm not sure. This has been a really important text because we're looking at the social practice that went on behind the text, and how can we see from the text what the values behind the outcome were, what context were the students working within, and how can we see their ideologically shaped context through the outcome? How do we see the values in a text? How do we see the context in a text? And so we're focusing on the structure of knowledge, the knowledge building towards the outcome, rather than the structure of a static text. We're not looking at what does an introduction look like, what does this look like, what does a literature review look like. We're looking at what do we have, what features are there here, is it descriptive, is it critical, is there an element of reflection, and how might the writers or the speakers have achieved that. So we're looking at this process, but this process needs to be acknowledged as a disruptive process, which is very participatory. So the students need to be participants, and this is also very helpful that we are using when we work through this with students. It's a negotiated practice, it's a reformulating practice, so it's not putting pen to paper, sitting down, you write this. It's not looking at the structure. If you can write this structure, you can create a piece of academic text. It's looking at how did you negotiate towards this outcome? How did you renegotiate? What did you do and what did you go through in order to achieve that? And what, if we see an example of a very interesting critical analysis, what do you think that the writers might have gone through? We want students to be able to be thinking in that respect. So if they can identify it, then they can perhaps recognise that there's been a process. So it's also a process that students need to be active and acknowledging that they are going to go through transformation. Their identity will become an integral part of the learning process. So it's not just about having a distant hypothesis, it's about them changing their knowledge and meaning making process, so changing their meaning. So we are looking at, can we see competencies in the writing, and can we, if students can identify those, can they become more comfortable in knowing what competencies they need in order to achieve a piece of writing, rather than are you being academic? We're looking at, are you achieving these competencies? So disruption in an art and design context is probably quite well known, and students, especially design students, are expecting this, but Orr and Shreeve particularly have come up with a very useful terminology that we use with students, the sticky curriculum, because pedagogies are uncomfortable, destabilising. All of these words we find quite helpful for students to understand that it's not a simple process. It will be destabilising, and it's about a procedure that they go through, a procedure of change. And particularly in art and design, the procedures might be very obscure and hard to codify. So every conversation that they have, all the thoughts and experiences they have, these become part of their development of their meaning making and situating themselves and their values and their voice within their discipline. So even though we are talking about art and design, we hope that this, in a conversation, it might be possible to transfer this to lots of different disciplines, because even though art design is maybe more well known for being particularly, for example, embodied. So it's an embodied process. They are physically making something, they're thinking while they're making, they are doing, they have sensual processes that they're going through. That's very common in art design, but perhaps it is also in other disciplines. They are embedded within a discipline. People are embodied in their social practice, in the historical context in which they're working. So we're hoping that some of these may be able to be also used in different contexts. So it's very pertinent in art design, embodied practice, which is embedded within their discipline, their values within their discipline, which then transfers to their inbrained knowledge, their thinking time. So we emphasise that they might be practice-based students, and they might be embedded within their disciplines. They're experts in their fields. But how does this transfer into the inbrained knowledge, which we might more easily refer to as the academic output. So, last slide for the background is Julia's writing. This has been really. I've only just started reading this, but this particularly resonates with what we're trying to do. The active process, that we're not learning how to compose a paragraph. We're trying to encourage students to understand the intellectual work that paragraphs do. What went on behind the scenes, the process in order to create the paragraph. And it might be a more elusive academic practice of developing academic voice. It is elusive, but we're trying to find different ways into teaching students how to recognise this and how to acknowledge that this is happening, and how can they do that. So we devised, through conversations with tutors, asking them, how do you expect students to develop? How do you expect them to develop towards demonstrating a critical, evaluative understanding of their discipline? So criticality, reflection is particularly difficult. So I interviewed a number of tutors across the college, and they continually talked about the process, but the process of inquiry. I'm just going to very briefly demonstrate that we use this as an iterative process. So we ask students to articulate what they understand, but maybe by a conversation that they've had with their peers, maybe from an artist talk or lecture or a reading. We ask them then to reflect on this and in their own heads, and then have a dialogue and consider what comes out and what changes through that dialogue. Make notes about this, have another dialogue, have a different dialogue in a different context, maybe a dialogue with themselves even, it doesn't matter. But it's about the iterative process so that they eventually come out with a reformulation. So this is the process that we continually work through with students, so that they are aware of the necessity of going through these processes in order to come out with something that is academic. So if we're asking students to do this, again, maybe from readings or from conversations that they've had, we also ask them to recognise that the reformulation, the final text that they might read by an artist or designer, the writer has already gone through this many times in many different formats. So we want them to recognise when they're reading that it's not a simple process, and what can they gain from a text by looking at a text. Can they understand any of these? Can they identify features that allow us to acknowledge that this has gone on? So, Orr and Bloom's taxonomy. We just use one example of what we use for this. These are the stages of the process of inquiry. The basic description. If they bring in other voices, are they from different contexts? If they talk about what they've done in their practice, can they compare it with other people? That's developing their higher order thinking skills. Do they then bring in, integrate with different formats of knowledge? So any reading that they're doing, if they're bringing all of this in and they're moving up the higher order processes, can they then use this to identify these elements in a text? So if they see, can they find reflection in a text? Can they find an example of where the writer has integrated different voices in a text? Can they find the writer's voice in the text? So it's not about looking at text and saying, this is the introduction. It's saying, where's the writer's voice? Is it a narrative voice? Is it a clear position? Is there, are there inconsistencies in the voice? Whatever it is, we use this alongside the other process with students, and we hope that we might be able to do that with you today. And I'm going to pass over to Sarah.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay.
So, let me just...
I hope we have a chance to discuss afterwards.
Great. Okay, so we have a Padlet. and on it we have a selection of texts for you. So we've selected 5 texts which give you a sense of the array of, as it were, academic writing in our institution and in the disciplines that we teach. Different attitudes, different approaches. Just a little sample for you today. The texts on the left-hand side, the 3 on the left, are published texts from very established academics. So these might be the texts, they are the texts our students are exposed to in terms of reading. The texts over here, we have a student dissertation, which we're very fond of. We use it endlessly in our teaching, and an architecture student. And we have a publication by one of the tutors, the programme leader, for jewellery and metalwork. So just to give you a sense of the different sorts of texts that our students, that are swirling around our students. And just to give you a tiny bit of detail on the approaches, because we're going to get you to choose one to dip into. Over at the beginning there, we've got a text on the subject of care, which is a theme that is very dominant at the moment in our institution. Students are responding to that word in lots of different ways. This is by a philosopher based here at Warwick, very interdisciplinary, eclectic knowledge base in her text. And just to give you a sort of flavour of that, her self-description on her website, on the website here: I work at the crossing of science and technology studies, feminist theory, and the environmental humanities. My most recent book, Matters of Care, attempts to connect a feminist materialist tradition of critical thinking on care with debates on more than human ontologies and ecological practices. So you can hear the sort of interdisciplinary conversations there, yes, in that tiny bit of description. So that's the sort of thing our students are digesting. These texts have got complex processes within them, complex journeys within them. The second one is Haraway, Donna Haraway, Tentacular Thinking. This is a hugely interesting sort of seminal piece. Effectively, I think of it as sort of creating new shapes for thinking about our era, really, new metaphors. And she's very keen on the tentacular as a metaphor for knowledge acquisition and conversations between communities, networking and so on. She started out as a scientist, interestingly. And now her writing has been described variously as a characteristic cyborg of sophistication and plain talk, elsewhere threadbare, scatty and besotted, or geo, eco, evo, devo, histo, techno, psycho encounters. So just again to sort of give you a flavour of what you might discover if you dip into that one. The design text in the centre, Fisher. That's, there are elements of that seem much more academic friendly in a conventional sense. So that's, as it were, perhaps the most familiar in terms of style and writing, perhaps to, if we think in terms of academic writing, our cliche of that. But there are elements of it that are dealing with embodied knowledge, which is absolutely beautifully dealt with. So, and that's a really key area, as Sean has already said, in the disciplines that we teach. So, giving great permission to subjectivity, I must say, and the word I as well. So, very personal description in that text, alongside critical analysis, very rigorous critical analysis. And then the last two, these are texts by, RCA folk. The student dissertation, very strong element of personal experience in that text. So if you want to get a sense of how students write about what they have experienced and then segue into academic analysis, that's a nice text to read. I recommend dipping in at the beginning of these texts, by the way. I know that there are whole texts on there, but the beginnings are worthwhile. And then finally, Jonathan's text, The Jeweller, Language as Practice. This is, again, very typical of our community. They are practice-based researchers, and the writing is often practice-based, and the writing is practice sometimes. And this artist uses text centrally in the things that he makes and has a very particular relationship with language. So he's very interesting. If you look at his text, it's very visual and surprising, perhaps, if you're used to academic journals and books that in a more orthodox manner.